Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from today. Welcome to the Global Risk Trends and Oz and USA Perspective webinar. I'm Janita Jung, Chair of Events and Administration for the ISRM Australia and New Zealand chapter, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. We have a distinguished panel of speakers from the ISRM's Australia and New Zealand and USA North America hub, who will share their insights on the emerging trends and issues in risk management from both a global and regional perspective. So let's dive into what's happening in the world of risk, what we think is coming down the line, and how we can all be better prepared. To kick things off, I am honoured to introduce Dr. Gav Schneider, the President of the ISRM Australia and New Zealand chapter. Dr. Gav is not only the Group CEO of Risk2 Solution, but also a recognised authority in the human-centric and integrated risk management. Dr. Gav, please take it away.
Thank you, Janita, and thank you everyone for joining us. Whether you're joining us live or you're watching the recording, it's wonderful for us to have the opportunity to collaborate with our colleagues in the US. And I think that's one of the strengths that the ISRM is able to provide, is that we can give a more global perspective of what's happening with risks and what's trending today. So we really look forward to having a chat and sharing some ideas, thoughts and observations, particularly in the complex, chaotic and fast-paced world we're in at the moment, where every day there seems to be something different, from a geopolitical issue, war, bridge collapses, cyber breaches, and the list keeps going on. Certainly lots for the panel to talk about. Thanks, Janita. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Gav. Next, we do welcome Matthew Porcelli, the chairman of the ISRM North America Hub. With his extensive background in safety and security management, Matthew brings a wealth of experience from working across various sectors. So, Matthew, we're eager to hear your insights on the U.S. risk environment.
I should say it's good evening here on this side of the pond. I don't know whether we can use that. I thought that was just a UK thing, but on this side of the world, Janita, thank you, and my leadership friends, Joe, Gav, and Brett. I am, as Janita said, I am the ISRM North America hub chair, and as Gav was just saying, just to lead into it, is that the risk trends, and especially in strategic risk and crisis management, that the ISRM offers, is that one thing that we try to push is the information sharing. Not to mention that, and I had said this before, that we have, after COVID, the lines on a map, let's all try to remove them right now, because we're all interconnected in one way, and that the best way to do this, and especially within, whether it's a U.S. risk or the North American with, let's say, critical infrastructure and any kind of AI security or any kind of risk on our end, can also flow its way over to Australia and anywhere in between. So no matter where we are on the globe, and especially what we feel here in the U.S., I mean specifically me, I'm in New Jersey. I'm sure Gav, Joe, and all throughout the world will feel it as well. So we really have to, come together and be ambassadors for the strategic risk and crisis management sector as well. So with that, and Gav mentioned we have those upcoming elections coming up as well here in the U.S. So, I'm just really excited and happy to be here. So thank you, Janita, very much.
Thank you, Matthew. Following Matthew, I'm delighted to introduce Joe Saunders, the Vice President of the ISRM Australia and New Zealand chapter. Joe is a leading expert in the field of occupational violence and brings a unique perspective on risk management from down under. So, Joe, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Janita, and thanks, Gav, Matt, and Brett for joining us. This is a really unique opportunity to compare notes, and we're talking just before we went live about how interesting it is to compare where we're at in Australia, where we are in the US. And I was reflecting that when I first got into security risk management initially, and then risk management more generally, the prevailing wisdom was that the US was sort of 5 to 10 years ahead of us in terms of risks and threats and things that were happening. And it seems like over the years, that gap has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller, and to the point where it's almost real time now. Just reflecting with some of our clients in the political space here in Australia, we're in such a unique time of globalization and access to the same media in real time. Like we know, for example, categorically know there will be some violence on the streets of Australia based on the fact that it's a US presidential election year. And that's never been a thing before. Maybe the last election, but before that, it wouldn't have mattered. It really wouldn't have mattered. We're only half a generation removed from just reading about the US election in a paper and no one would even know about it or care about it. And now there will be people that are politically charged and will commit acts of violence or crime as a result of what's happening in another country. So that is a really interesting space for us to work in, and why it's so important for organizations like the ISRM to be able to have this platform, to be able to talk with each other and to be able to compare and see what's happening and see what's being done from a control point of view, to protect our infrastructure, to protect our organizations and our communities from various emerging risks, but also on the other side to capitalize on the opportunities that are coming out of that. And I do know we'll talk about the post-COVID picture of risk and what's come out of that. But if we fail to capitalize on the things we learned or capitalize on the innovations that were generated through disruption, then it's not good enough for one of us to benefit. Like we should all be sharing notes and all of us benefiting and growing for the sake of humanity. So really excited for any opportunity we have to compare notes on things like that. And I guess probably the spoiler for my contributions is that I think as much as every conference you go to at the moment is very AI heavy and technology heavy, and we're all going to be redundant and Skynet's going to be taking over soon. I think ultimately both the risks and the opportunity come from the human side. So, but I won't spoil too much. So we'll leave it at that. But thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Joe. Our final speaker before the panel discussion is Brett Mott, the Vice President of the ISRM North America Hub. Brett's distinguished career in Army Special Forces and his expertise in security and crisis management have made him a pivotal figure in the risk management world. So, Brett, we look forward to hear from you.
Thank you, Janita. Thank you, everyone who's here or attending. As Gav said, whether you're live or recording. I'll piggyback on what Joe just said. My thoughts on this are, as he said, the need for collaboration and human input, and that's where the solutions lie. And he hit it on the head. The world has changed so much in how quickly events take place and then how quickly the effects are felt. And I'm a firm believer that the way to prepare and mitigate and then respond to these events is through partnerships and human interaction. And that's what I'll be covering in my topics. And I look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say as well.
Thank you, Brett. So thank you to everyone for your introductions. We'll now move into our panel discussion where we'll delve a little bit deeper into what's coming down the line for global risk management and how individuals, organizations, and governments can prepare. We would also love to address any of your burning questions as well for those of you tuning in. Please do submit your questions to info@isrm.org.au and we'll do our best to get to them. But let's get into it. So, Dr. Gav, I'd like to start with you. Considering your extensive experience in integrated risk management and your role as ISRM ANZ president, how do you perceive the current global risk landscape evolving, and what should risk professionals be most aware of today?
Thanks, Janita. And, a question like that probably takes much more than 4 experts on a panel discussing what's going on around us to actually put meat to. But practically, many of the challenges we see happening today are not necessarily brand new challenges, even though they feel like it. So if we take something like AI, for example, we've already been through, cellular communication technology disruption and changes, the birth of the internet. There have been so many huge technological evolutions that have happened just in the last decade or two that, we should not be so nervous and scared about things like AI. But it's natural if you look at the way humans are responding today. We actually need to look backwards to be able to look at where we are so we can look forwards. So looking backwards, we had lockdowns, significant disruption. We put things in place to save lives, i.e. social distancing, closing borders, etc. But really what we did is not necessarily think through the side effects of stopping human interaction and diminishing the capability for humans to be able to share knowledge and information on a one-to-one basis. So everyone is pretty rusty in how we communicate. People are pretty rusty in how we deal with conflict, and people are pretty rusty in how we deal with trauma. So if you look at that on the human side, it's no surprise we're seeing incredible frustration in lots of first world countries. We're also seeing a productivity slowdown. which I'd be very interested to compare with my colleagues in the US if they're seeing the same thing we're seeing in Australia. But if you look at the Australian context, we have, I think, 3.9% unemployment, so pretty much everyone is working. Huge inflationary pressures and lots of instability and fatigue. The instability is not necessarily being driven, from my perspective, by what's happening in Australia, but if we switch on any news channel, every war seems like it's right here, and every cyber breach seems like it happened yesterday or now to us. And on top of all of that, I think Joe's point around the US elections and other elections, also creating uncertainty and stress are pretty significant. So, just focusing on a few things, because I'm sure my colleagues are going to have many more other ideas to talk about. I think part of the challenge we've got at the moment is actually just calming people down and trying to get it back to business. And when I'm saying getting back to business, that's not necessarily just trying to drive profit. It's making sure that people are thinking effectively, making good decisions, and looking at the whole picture, not just the misinformation, disinformation that might be getting fed to them on a mobile device at any given point. So what does this mean for risk professionals? We've got a harder job than we've probably ever had before. We're transitioning into a state where a risk professional 10 years ago was deemed valuable based primarily on their ability to control operational risk. So to be able to control and manage risk within a fixed container in an environment where there's a high degree of control and certainty. Fast forward to where we are now. We have no fixed container. We're a network of all these interconnected pieces, and things are changing quicker than we can keep up with. So we really have to just slow down, I think, to speed up a little. And we have to be able to get rational thinking back in the game. So without those attributes being driven by risk professionals, we're going to continue to see, I believe, for the next 3 to 5 years, the legacy of COVID play out. And it's going to play out in things which I'm sure Joe will talk about, like occupational violence. It's going to play out in mistakes, like we saw yesterday with the bridge collapse. It's going to continue to play out with cyber breaches, and it's going to continue to play out with mental health challenges for the workforce and productivity slowdowns. So if you're looking at the world of risk management, there's a few transitions I think we have to make. One, we have to move from a risk manager to either somebody who's a coach, an advisor, a supporter, an influencer, a mentor, because very few risk managers actually manage risk in their businesses. Most of them are more advisors or compliance experts, and we've got to start to change that paradigm. So looking forward, I think we'll see a shift. I think we'll see some parts of risk management double down on compliance-based activities, but we'll see a lot more of us having to morph and change the way we work and think to cope with what's going on. If we aren't going to be the exemplars, it's going to be exceptionally difficult. I don't see any other vocation other than C-suite leadership that has as much impact on the way economies, businesses, and individuals are performing than the vocation of risk. And when I'm talking about that, we're incorporating business continuity, crisis management, and all the subfields within that. We've got a huge responsibility on us, and I don't think it should be taken lightly. Much more to say about that, but I'm very keen to hear what my other panelists have got to say. Thank you, Janita.
Thank you, Dr. Gav. Thanks for setting that sort of global risk landscape for us. Matthew, I'd like to head over to you. Obviously, with your background in safety and security management, as well as your position as ISRM North America Hub Chairman, how do you see emerging technologies impacting risk management practices, particularly in the context of security?
Thank you, Janita. And Dr. Gav, thank you again for that great lead up. Yeah, and it's, everybody nowadays, everything is AI. Rightly so, the Internet of Things. I'm a private security manager, frontline security manager as my primary position. I'm one to say that you can never replace a human being, and that goes with with risk and crisis management. I mean, the landscape nowadays, really, what we're worried about here is how much, and I know Joe's going to speak about this as well, is the amount of how much the aggressors can take advantage of fear and more of a reactive rather than proactive. Dr. Gav said it perfectly. Normally, people don't like to push forward or invest or spend money unless something happens. We had the Francis Scott Key Bridge that collapsed. That is a major artery, just like any kind of transportation or critical infrastructure. a city is bleeding, those bridges, for example, or water or power grid or whatnot, the minute those shut down, or a lot of people like to say newsworthy things happen, that gets people moving. Now, where does emerging technology fit into it? Think about who mans all those posts. I mean, private security services nowadays makes up, it's a multi-billion-dollar business. It is a lot more financially feasible to put contract security, for example, in government-related positions, as far as, you know, at checkpoints, whether it be at an airport or maybe at a bridge. Look at it this way. The emergent technology it's great. We need it. It's got a yin and a yang effect, because the aggressors can also hijack, no pun intended, that technology to use against us. But at the same token, emerging technology is something that our frontline team, whether it be somebody in a security, internal security, or you know, just reporting up to the C-suite, that we have to get used to this. Because, and again, I've managed numerous, over my 20 years of doing this, I must have managed about 350 officers at one time. I'm not using that as a pat on the back, but the thing is, you try to share security countermeasures more on the technological standpoint to somebody maybe who came from a country that didn't have a computer growing up and stuff like that. Those emerging technologies, you know, whether it be, again, I think the saying is the guns, gates, and guards. You need the human factor in there, but there has to be a convergence between your physical security countermeasures, and such as, you know, your cameras, your like I said, your any kind of security, technological security device you have, coupled with the human factor. Because I guarantee that when what hits the fan, you'll see people being forced out of that reactive, and unfortunately it's more or less sometimes mostly the C-suite, to the proactive. That's why, as risk managers and security managers and professionals and academics, let's say, here, it's imperative that we foster emerging technologies and the convergence with security staff, or, heaven forgive me, because I hate using the word because of the stereotype, the guard, as a security professional, and to train them, because they are the front line, and they are in a concentric circles of protection model. They are the ones that are going to house all the data that when whether a natural or man-made crisis occurs, and it's going to affect pretty much everybody, not just singular most of the time, that they feel comfortable on how to operate that equipment and to be that imperative piece of the puzzle to provide the clients or the C-suite or protect themselves and their families. So, emerging technologies, absolutely. It's something we need to foster in risk and crisis management and general security operations. That being said, we have to be smart. I do a lot of social engineering training. Aggressors are smart. They will know how to counter us. So, I mean, and again, we're not here, and Dr. Gav said it as well, too. It's almost like, or maybe of inference that it's not that people are not proactively risk conscious. However, you don't see too many go out of their way, and that's something we have to change to target harden and so forth. And, the force multiplier here is emerging technologies. So, thank you, Janina.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you for that, for your insights into the impact of technology on risk management. Joe, as a thought leader in occupational violence, and I am the ISRM ANZ Vice President, what strategies do you recommend for organizations looking to enhance their preparedness against workplace violence in today's risk environment?
Sure, it's a big question, right? As Gav said, any one of these questions really could be its own webinar, or a book or something. But I would just sort of take a back step away from just talking about workplace violence for a second, and just build upon something that Gav introduced and Matt expanded upon. We as a species are not designed for the world we live in right now. Like we just fundamentally are not. Our ability to process information is not up to speed with the amount of information that we are asked to process. The number of people we are supposed to keep human relationships with is far lower than the number that we're actually expected to. There's a lot of things. We are really well built for waking up when the sun comes up, figuring out where we're going to get food from, and interacting with the same 50 to 100 people until we die a natural death in our 40s. Right? That's what we're kind of designed for. And now each one of us, it's 8:23 in the morning here in Brisbane, Australia. I've taken in more information this morning than my ancestors would have taken in a year. And that's a fairly light morning, actually. Like, I haven't done anything out of the ordinary. This is checking news cycles, checking my phone before I got out of bed, having a conversation, and then jumping on a call with a colleague in the US, and then doing this webinar. That's just a normal morning. But we're essentially, what we're doing right now is it's like we're taking a 1977 Commodore PET and asking it to run Photoshop. Like, people are glitching. We're not built for this. We don't have the RAM for modern society. And because of that, we're trying to keep up, but things keep getting faster and faster and faster. And just looking at the last 30 years, I mean, there's been, I really don't want to make this an AI webinar because there's so many AI webinars. But a lot of very, very smart people that understand it better than me have said that AI will be as a bigger disruption than the birth of the internet, right? Or generative AI, not AI in general, but generative AI will be a bigger disruption than the birth of the internet. Those who can remember a pre-internet age, like that's pretty hard to fathom. Like, everything changed. But every new development accelerates the progress of the next development, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. It's crazy to think that, you know, what the world looked like in the 1950s compared to now, that's only 70 years ago. It's insane to think about how fast things are moving, and each new development, as I said, we'll just bring on the next one, the next one, the next one. So for those of us that are in this space, we're actually excited by it, right? We're excited by what's coming next. If you're terrified of it, the world is only going to get scarier. You have to be able to embrace it. But excitement is still a stimulus, and we're overstimulated all the time. It's so much to learn. You will never understand everything that's going on, and if you try, it's at the expense of something else that you're not paying attention to. So I don't want to paint a bleak picture. I just want to say that's the operating system we're working with here, and we can't be surprised when our colleagues, when our friends, when our communities are doing things that seem out of character, or they're not following the rules, or they're not following the social norms, because people are just overwhelmed. And I don't see a way, either we wait a couple of generations and hope evolution catches up, or we need to have a little bit of kindness and empathy and try and build support structures of people that aren't keeping up. Because at the moment, people are breaking. And I know Gav introduced the idea about we're seeing a decrease in productivity. We're seeing decrease in loyalty to companies. We're seeing all sorts of things happen, increase in mental health and psychosocial harm, and all these things that are concerning. But there's bigger causes than just what my company policy says, or bigger causes about whether I'm working from home or working from an office. There's a lot more underlying that. So I guess just to use that as a platform. To answer your question about workplace violence and aggression and so on, I will just quickly clarify. So I understand we'll probably have a mixed audience between US, Australia, and probably other as well. In Australia, usually when we talk about occupational violence, thankfully, most of our occupational violence is third-party initiated. So it'd be people coming into the workplace that don't work there and being aggressive or threatening or whatever. It does also include things like domestic violence in the workplace and conflict between colleagues and so on. That's a common thing. Usually when I speak in the US, workplace violence is more referred to the insider threat or an internal threat with a person coming to their workplace and causing violence. So either way, it still matters, and still the treatments are similar. Ultimately, I think what we need to be looking at is, to Matt's point, it's not about guards and gates and guns, right? It's not about access control. It's not about CEPTED. It's not about like, good security treatments help, no doubt. Like, we should have good security treatments, but ultimately we want to understand the underlying cause. We need to look at the human beings. How are we identifying changes in behavior? How are we recruiting? How are we background checking? How are we do it? Yeah, we do background checks and we do PERSEC processes before we hire someone, but are we continually doing that? Are we checking how someone's doing 6 months from now? Do we have a system in place to identify that Tom, who's a great employee and has been really good for the last 18 months, is all of a sudden arriving late. Are we flagging that in some way? Does he look like he's been sleeping in his car? Has he mentioned that his marriage is breaking down? Has he mentioned that his is he gambling? Are we seeing suspicious activity on his work email? Like, are there things happening that might show that Tom's in distress that might be then a cause for concern well before that manifests in a major incident? And it can't be through a lens of we need to find an excuse to fire Tom, but rather every single Tom in the organization needs to have some sort of support network in place so that we can identify changes in behavior and hopefully offer support if that support is available or is it appropriate for the situation. So I think just to round out on that, because I literally could talk about this the rest of the webinar and that would be unfair. But I think we need to take a back step and look at workplace violence or occupational violence from an overall systemic health point of view, as opposed to a response to an incident. And if we can do that, we'll have less incidents. That's my hypothesis, and I'll stand on that until someone proves me wrong.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks for bringing sort of AI into the conversation as well, which is quite important. But more importantly, thanks for your insights over the occupational violence and our risk preparedness as well. I'd like to move over to Brett on some sort of cross-sector collaboration. Drawing from your diverse experience in security, crisis, and emergency management, and of course your role as ISRM North America Hub Vice Regional President, how important is cross-sector collaboration in addressing complex global risks? And can you share an example of maybe a successful collaboration that you've seen?
Well, thank you, Janita. Quickly, I want to touch on one comment Joe made about whether our current systems are fit for purpose. I have to give a shameless plug to the ISRM Executive Director, Dr. David Rubens, who's fond of saying you can't solve a 2024 crisis with a 1995 toolkit, which I think is in line with what Joe said. I'm going to borrow from what everybody did and look at for my answer, say I'm going to look backwards in order to move forwards, and I'm going to focus very much on the human aspect. I'm also going to throw a curveball in that I'm going to talk a little bit more about micro cross-sector collaboration and then how that can feed into the macro cross-sector. Currently, January of last year, the UN General Assembly issued the midterm report for the Sendai Framework for Disaster and Risk Reduction. I just two quick comments from it. It noted progress was inconsistent across countries and access to data, technology, and systems remains inadequate. And I think from a macro perspective, that shouldn't be a surprise when we're trying to do something globally. And touching on what Gav said earlier, you've got countries at different levels of development, and it's a fact with different levels of political, social, and cultural interest or concern in emergencies and disasters and how much they want to put into it. So to me, when we struggle at the macro level, we need to look down to the micro level. And if I can just provide a couple of quick examples, going back, and again, I want to touch on what Joe said. When I was little growing up, emergency management was the sole purview of the public sector. So when I grew up with, in the US, 3 networks and public television. There was no cable and nothing else. And if you saw news reports from a hurricane, tornado, whatever disaster, it was always the National Guard and police and fire and rescue, et cetera. And that applies to both actually responding to the event and then also the recovery process afterwards, transporting food, water, needed supplies, et cetera. Well, compare that with what we see today. There was no private sector then, and now we can look at how, I'll just give some quick examples of evolution of how the private sector has become a key partner. In Hurricane Andrew struck Southern Florida in 1992 and caused $57 billion in damage adjusted to today's dollars. One of the things that came out of that is what's kind of been referred to as the Walmart effect, which is there was a realization that the way we were doing business, which was pre-event saying, here's where an assembly area is going to be. If you need water, this is where you need to go. If you need medical attention, this is where you need to go. The problem was you designate those in advance, the hurricane comes through, it doesn't care where it is, it wipes everything out. And now you've got to designate new areas. But in 1992, no cell phones, no social media, no internet. The means of communication were landline phones, television, FM or AM radio. and all those were negatively affected, if not completely knocked out by the hurricane. So the realization came, we need places where we can have people go, and a place like Walmart, which has a huge parking lot that can be set up for aid stations, communication stations, shelter, sanitary facilities, whatever, lent themselves to being a part of the process. As that evolved, it brought in other private sector organizations. For example, companies that manufacture soda pop also do bottled water. They are very good at moving those things from point A to point B. And if you have a disaster that wipes out a particular area and you don't have water and you need these things, these organizations are very good at getting things from point A to point B, which adds to or augments what the public sector can do. In the Nepal earthquake in 2015, quite a few areas were off limits. They were inaccessible due to landslides, rockfall, things like that. And it made it difficult for the Nepalese government to prioritize their response because they didn't know which areas needed help most. So a multitude of private citizens who owned unmanned aerial vehicles or drones flew those over the areas and gave real-time information to the government so they could figure out where they needed to direct their prioritize and direct their support. And again, these are just private citizens who saw a need and said, hey, I can help on this. And then the last example I like to give is Hurricane Maria, which struck the Caribbean in 2017, especially hard hit on Puerto Rico, which is U.S. territory. Of the just over 3,000 deaths, over 2,900 were in Puerto Rico. Now, Hurricane Maria is a kind of a contentious point because there was a severe disagreement between the local Puerto Rican government and the U.S. federal government on the response. That's a discussion for another day, but it affects how some private sector responses were able to help. So in one instance, I talked about the distribution of water. Well, because Puerto Rico is so prone to hurricanes because where it's located, some of these companies decided let's pre-position water in advance in multiple places since you never know how the hurricane is going to travel across the island. And it paid off because when the hurricane hit, some of these areas were still intact, these warehouses, and they were able then to distribute water to people in Puerto Rico, which took that onus off the public sector, and they could the emergency services could focus on other things. Additionally, another tying with what Joe said, kind of a sign of the times, because of disagreement between the territorial and federal government, the local citizens became skeptical of some of the information they were receiving on where they should go, and were starting to doubt what they were being told. So in an effort to try and improve the the response, emergency services recruited local celebrities from sports, entertainment, whatever, and they actually broadcast messages that were considered more credible and believable by the public in Puerto Rico. In all three of those examples, for the most part, were ad hoc, or two examples were ad hoc, in that they weren't necessarily planned in advance. It was just people identifying a need. But it set the stage for what can happen in the future. What else can we do? And I'm a believer in, from my time in the military, you can't prepare for everything, but the more things you prepare for and the more things you think through in the thought process, it makes your mind more agile and you're better able to react when something happens that you weren't necessarily expecting. So to close out my remarks, what I would ask is everybody who's attending this, look in your own organization at what you do. And while you may think there's no tie between your what your field of business is and emergency management and emergency response, I would propose that there is something there that you can contribute. And what I'd like to see is, rather than the disaster happens, we do an after action review, lessons learned, et cetera, and then people jump in. If we proactively think and try and get ahead of it, we're never going to be able to do. There's always going to be earthquakes and typhoons and tsunamis, et cetera. But over time, if we look at what happens in our communities, again, pushing it down to local level, we can better prepare for that because we know what's happening more so than tying it back to the international piece. It's hard for large organizations like the UN or large NGOs. They work globally and they have local actors, of course, but I still maintain the community knows best how it needs to respond. And so I'd like to see people looking for ways they can contribute and enhance that public-private partnership, which then better prepares us and mitigates the effects when we run into problems with emergency management. Thank you.
Brett, thank you so much for that, and thank you for delving deeper into all of that information, and looking forward to getting into some of the upcoming questions that we have as well. I'm going to open this up to all panelists, and please just jump on in if you have an answer to these questions, and definitely do a little bit of a discussion here. But to all of our panelists, based on your respective areas of expertise, what emerging threats do you believe will shape the global risk landscape in the next 5 to 10 years, and how can risk professionals start preparing today? I know we've touched on a little bit of this, but to continue those discussions, please come on the mic, and I would love to hear your thoughts.
I'm happy to take a first swing at that. Thanks, Janita. Without going through the conventional emerging and current risks that most of us have discussed already on this webinar, and probably almost all of our listeners are familiar with, the generic pieces. I don't think anybody is looking at climate as though it's not a risk variable we've got to be looking at. I don't think anybody is ignoring geopolitical risk. As we said, AI and tech and evolving tech is there. I think the bigger question is practically what are we going to do about the fast pace of change, and how are we going to develop coping mechanisms to manage that actually as a risk? Because that's one of those causal factors that's not often discussed. And we'll often highlight areas, for example, like AI adoption. And we go, AI adoption should be better or should be worse, depends on your risk appetite. But realistically, part of the challenge we've got is, why is it that humans are not able to keep up with tech? And it's a simple equation. If we look at it, unless you're an absolutely passionate about technology, chances are every piece of software and sometimes the technological hardware we're using has more features than most users use it for. So if you look at your mobile phone already, you look at Microsoft Office, you look at any of these platforms we interact with, the usability has already overtaken most users' appetite, knowledge, and skill. Yet we keep improving. So what's really interesting is we've got this sort of, and I would say this is going to last the next 10 to 20 years, depending on how quickly things go. We've got this ambidextrous world where many of the things we are doing still fit into a simple and complicated operating paradigm, where we have a pretty good degree of control and certainty, where conventional risk, response, and prevention strategies work comparatively well. And then we've got this shift into complexity and chaos, which is where conventional systems have failed, or our conventional systems can't cope, and things are changing too quick for the conventional systems to work with. So probably the last part for me, other than starting to look at how we manage the way humans can change so that we can get better at that, is for us to also be looking at what can we do to help, as mentioned earlier. And I think a solid understanding of not just one-dimensional siloism has to happen. This idea of a job for life, where I'll get one job, one skill, one vocation, and I'll only work in one sector, is gone. I think we've got to accept that reality. And I even look at the people who work for our business in Risk to Solution. Janine and Joe, you're both good examples of this. You've changed jobs several times. Your jobs have morphed. You do things you didn't do when you started working for us, and it keeps changing. So we've got to get comfortable with that. And I think the risk of not creating humans who can perform better with continuous change is that we'll see more burnout, more frustration, less adoption of tech. And, to be honest, I'm not really worried about the huge issues. Issues with urbanization, issues with flooding, fires. We've been dealing with that as a human species since the beginning. And over time, we'll find ways to cope and deal with those. It's what's the casualty rate and what's the impact going to be along the way that we can manage. And when I say casualty rate, I'm thinking more in the mental health and performance side of it, and hopefully not necessarily in the actual physical killing of people. But I do think we're in a world where that hasn't gone away. And as much as people would love us to be going, we're all in this together and it's one united front. We've got several wars, pretty violent wars going on. We've got terrorist attacks happening every day all over the world. Mass kidnappings of school children in Nigeria, and all sorts of crazy things still going on that we don't hear about. So we've also got to be pragmatic that as much as we want to make things like climate the primary focus, there are still practical security-based risks that we're dealing with every day to humans, countries, businesses, etc., that we can't forget. So to close off from my side, I think it's a two-way process, right? We need to get really good at management, which most humans already are when we've got control and certainty, because we've had about 500 years of practice there. We're not that good at uncertainty management. We've got to up that skill set. And I think that's where strategic risk really comes into its own. Thanks, Janita. Happy to understand what my colleagues think of this topic.
Yes, thank you so much, Gav. Matt or Brett, would you like to jump in here?
Yeah, actually, if I may, Johnny, Gav said it perfectly. And, the one thing that I feel a lot don't look at is how damaging reactivity can be. Perfect example, or no such thing as perfect, but an example. Say I'm a security manager. Say I start a brand new site with a client. There's security post orders already in place and crisis response, plans. Okay, Hurricane Sandy hit the New York metropolitan area in 2012. Basically catastrophic. We lessons learned. We went through it, as Brett was saying. We go through it. After action plan, lessons learned. What good is that? Now, all right, I put it together. I put it on a shelf, whether it be file-wise or hard copy-wise. 5 years go by, no other hurricane, no other, let's say, man-made crisis, natural crises happens. One thing that I feel that I get, all of us across the board don't realize is that time is a luxury we don't have. That 5 years for preparedness, drills, let me put it this way, I'd rather find mistakes in a drill or some kind of audit that I do during a simulation than in real time, because once it's in real time, it's too late. It's too late. Also, too, and not to go off on a tangent, but actually, I want to bring up too the important. Brett was saying it as well. Urban resilience is critical. Again, most people don't understand the concept. ISRM did a fantastic conference on urban resiliency. As a private security manager, for example, and Brett had brought up some instances. I'm going to bring up Hurricane Katrina. And if I remember from reading this, those individuals who worked at the local Walmart, they were able to get those resources of water faster than when they had to go through the U.S. government to do it. And again, there are certain protocols you have to follow through the government, which is fine. I respect that. But at the same token, everybody basically chips in. So if I'm a private security manager in a city, I'm going to go to the police department, create a connection there, communication line with the resource officer, the community resource officer. I'm going to go to the local supermarket, get a connection there, because I guarantee that at that point, that's Brett's cat. I love that cat. I guarantee that when a crisis happens, a lot of the preparedness portions may not work. So we have to rely on in the immediate area, hence urban resilience, because again, that's just imperative. And not to be cynical, but there's so much reactivity, because God forbid we may have to spend some money. But the way I look at it, would you rather spend money on a tarnished reputation? Because you could replace equipment. You could replace a building. Let's just say, yes. People and reputation, once that is tarnished, it's very difficult to bounce back from, especially if that comes from negligence. I'm not trying to sound cynical, but being that we're in, generally a more or less reactive, pessimistic society, when something happens that's detrimental, whether it be a personal crisis or something that affects a geographic area, my point is, it's so important to prepare and use that time wisely to make those connections, to harden your urban resilience, as well as counter the reactivity. If you haven't had a drill, you're depending on whatever you got to, and again, briefly, and that's what enterprise security risk management, ISRM, is to ask your C-suite, what keeps you up at night? for example, Matthew Porcelli Industries, which I don't have, I'm being fictitious here. Maybe if I lose, if I gain to lose one thing, that keeps me up at night. It may be different for Joe, maybe different for Brett, maybe different for Gav, for our individual places of work. But it's identifying that and hardening the urban resilience in conjunction with strategic proactivity. That's my whole spiel. Strategic proactivity. That's my cliff notes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Matt. I'm just looking at the time. I'm about 10 minutes out until the end of the webinar, so I would like to probably move on to some of these other questions that we have. Now, with the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously that was a very pivotal event for risk management across the globe. What are some of the key lessons that organizations should carry forward from this experience, according to your observations and experiences? Joe or Brett, would you like to jump in on this one?
Sure, happy to jump in first, Janita. Look, I'll try to keep it succinct to make sure Brett's got a chance to share his thoughts as well. But I think it does dovetail nicely into what's the strategic risk priorities for the next 5 to 10 years. I think while to Matt's point, we've gotten very reactive, right? Because even within our own business, we've stopped talking about what's our strategic goal for this year. It's like, what's the next goal for the next 3 months, right? Because anything beyond that feels like it's fantasy land, right? Anything could be different in 3 months' time, and we very much fell into that cycle as a society during COVID, because everything was changing. Everyone's watching the news every day to find out what the numbers are, what the rules are, what the regulations are, what industry is going to be open tomorrow, which ones aren't. I think we have to be able to take a step back from that a little bit and look at what do we know? What's the trajectory over the next 5 to 10 years? And how do we prepare for that now, so that not because we need to necessarily start acting like it is now, but because we need to have steps in place to be able to manage it when it comes. And I'm just looking at things like the workforce. It was only a couple of years ago that most of us in management positions were baby boomers. Now we're at a point where boomers are not completely out of the workforce. I mean, the youngest boomers are only 60. So there's still a lot of boomers around, but the majority of the workforce is Gen X and Gen Y. Where in the next couple of years, we're going to have no boomers in the workforce. Everyone's going to be Gen X or younger. All right. And I'm sorry to say that's the Gen X on the call, but you're next, right? The oldest Gen Xers are about to turn 60. So we need to start thinking about what does a workplace look like where the senior management are Gen Ys and the middle managers are Gen Zs and the workers are Gen Alphas, right? What does that look like? What do we need to have in place for that? And it's not enough for us to be old man yells at cloud and start saying, well, they don't communicate properly and they don't do this and they like to do text messaging instead of phone calls and that's not how professionals conduct themselves. Well, too bad. That's how they're going to be conducting themselves. So how do we build systems that allow for that, the natural predisposition, as well as growing our people and letting them mature and develop things outside their comfort zone? But we need to start looking beyond that. And I think COVID has taught us that. There's a lot of things we never thought would work that had to work during COVID, and we need to capture that and make sure that we are capturing those messages, but also not being stuck in this reactive 24-hour news cycle where we're just spinning plates waiting, like, because something else is on fire or someone else is at war and we need to do something about that now. We also need to be looking at where are we going to be in 10 years' time and what are we going to wish we'd prepared for when we get there, as opposed to trying to react to everything along the way and hope it ends up for the best. So that's a very summarized version, I guess, of let's be prepared. The other point I'll just throw in there: generative AI is not going away. It's going to replace a lot of jobs. It's only going to get smarter. It's only going to get better. We're going to have less people that are involved in professional roles that basically will have a QA function as opposed to an actual doing the work function. So what does that mean for everybody else? What does that mean? How do we prepare our kids to enter that workforce so that in 15 years they have a job that's relevant as opposed to a job that was relevant now? What do we do for that? These are the bigger picture things for me that I think we need to start looking at as a strategic risk manager at a societal level, not just in our organization. So I'll end on that point.
Thank you, Joe. Gab or Brett, would you like to jump in on this one? Gab, I'll go to you.
Sure. Conscious that I've spoken quite a lot already on the webinar, but I think part of the challenge, and what Joe was talking about too, is it's one of my mentors once said to me, it's really easy to know when to get in, it's really hard to know when to get out. And we are it's an interesting point Joe makes about the sort of transition of leadership and the change of leadership styles, the change of ways of working, the change of work preferences. And this is all happening really fast. And it's happening with the digital overlay all on top of it. So I think it's really important for us not to fall into the trap of just going, well, the World Economic Forum publishes the top 10 risks. Control Risks and Marsh publish their risk reports, and these are the global risk trends. We've also got to look practically at the risks of things that are not that popular for risk experts to talk about, but actually make a difference to performance. And what are we doing about that? If we talk particularly about the world of risk, I had a fascinating interaction not too long ago. I was actually giving a talk at a high school, and one of the students came up to me afterwards, a 15-year-old, very dynamic young lady, and said to me, "I like what you do. How do I get into what you do?" And it was kind of awkward because I didn't have a direct career path to say, if you actually want to be in strategic risk management, this is a way you can get there. So we've got a lot of work to do as well around changing this idea of the way we tackle risk management. And I think it's going to become not just more of an established profession, but equally, we've got to get everybody thinking like a highly competent risk expert. Every C-suite person, every frontline manager, and arguably every parent should be understanding risk management so they make better decisions. And then we can relate that back to strategy, and hopefully we can start tackling some of the challenges that we've got to face in the global environment, which, in fairness, are things that are different. But generations before have had their own challenges. If we look World War I, World War II, various other issues that have continued to go through, like life is not simple. And we're actually, I think, blessed and lucky. We're probably in one of the most exciting eras of human evolution. The opportunity is for us to grab. And if we can do it well, right, the world will be a significantly better place. If we don't do it well, I think we'll be in a lot of trouble. Thanks, Janita.
Thank you, Gav. And just building upon that question as well, as we are sort of nearing the last 5 minutes of the webinar, Brett and Matt, I might come to you guys first. But resilience has become quite a bit of obviously a buzzword in the risk management community. From each of your viewpoints, what are the critical components of building a resilient organizations in today's VUCA world or volatile world? And you can kind of carry on from the last question as well into that question. So Brett, I might come to you first.
Thank you. I'll go back to what I said before, and I think the key to resilience is a buzzword that's thrown around a lot, but whether you're talking about organizational, whatever, it starts with people. And are you taking care of your people and helping them? Someone touched, I think it was Gav, touched on mental wellness. And you look at how crazy the world is today. And after the pandemic, people thought, okay, we'll get a handle on this. Well, I attended a webinar some time ago on living in a world of uncertainty. And what fascinated me was all four panelists said, things have always been uncertain. That's how life is. It's just the intensity that varies at times. So to Gav's point about being comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity, the more we can do to help our people and realize that the same things that bother us, the political, social, cultural problems, the wars, everything, they're dealing with that on a daily basis. And if we're not helping them to become more personally resilient, then we're not really, we can't expect to have a resilient organization if we're neglecting our individuals and we're just putting the organization before them. So my thought is focusing on our people is going to make the organization better, and that's where the effort should start.
Thank you, Brett. And Matt?
Also, Brett had said, invest in your people. Never underestimate whomever you have within your security framework, everybody from the frontline security officer to the CRO or your CSO, they all have a voice. No matter, again, it's, if you really want to target harden and strengthen and more or less strengthen against a crisis, to get, just to recovery, because that's what it, what it comes down to, that, heaven forbid, if there is a crisis, just remember that everybody from the front lines, and actually think about your janitorial, any kind of contractor, whomever that is within your scope of your geographical fixed asset, let's just say, or your organization has something to add, even if it doesn't seem like that. And I think the more that we understand and nurture that, the more your chief risk officer or your chief security officer will have that seat. And I'll be figurative. We'll go from being back here at the C-suite table just a little bit closer, because again, that's what it comes down to. Take care of your people and they will take care of you.
Thank you. And Gav and Joe, any final thoughts on that one?
There's so many takeaways from my perspective out of this webinar, and Matt's point around, the seat at the table and other executives listening in is really important. Probably my parting note to everybody who tuned in and listened, whether you've been live or you're watching this in recording, is what got us here is probably not what's going to get us where we need to go next. And bearing in mind where we need to go next is changing dynamically. We need to get more comfortable with uncertainty, and we need to get way, way, way more comfortable with linking strategy and risk, and moving away from a mindset that risk management is an operational problem alone or an operational area alone. It's actually a massive opportunity for us to make better decisions and manage uncertainty more effectively, which I think everybody who works in the ISRM, who's given their time to listen to this sort of webinar, resonates with the idea. It's not trying to preach to the converted, because most of you get it. It's how do we get the message out there to everybody else? So thank you, panelists, and thank you everyone else for tuning in and helping us share some of these ideas. Thanks, Janita.
Thank you, Gav. Just as we sort of approach the end of our webinar, I would obviously like to thank all of our esteemed speakers for their invaluable insights, and our audience for your participation in sending through some of those questions that we were able to ask our panelists. It's clear that understanding and preparing for global risk trends is more critical than ever. And we do hope that today's discussion has provided you with a bit of a deeper understanding and actionable strategies to navigate the evolving risk landscape. But the ISRM and all of our panelists are available to be connected with on LinkedIn. So please do reach out if you have any further questions or want to get in touch. On behalf of the ISRM Australia and New Zealand and our USA chapters, thank you for joining us today. Please stay connected with the ISRM for more information sessions like this in the future, and have a great day or evening wherever you are. And thank you very much. And we do hope to see you on the next webinar. Thank you.